Convene our meeting. Let's stand if you can, and we'll sing our national anthem. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. We would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa of the Three Fires Confederacy. May I have a motion to adopt the minutes of the previous council meeting, November 18th? Councillor Peters, seconded by Councillor Sherwood. All in favor? Very good. So we're going to start off our meeting with staff reports. We don't have any presentations or delegations tonight, so we're going to start off with Mr. John Hambides of Pomax Consulting. Mr. Hambides is here to answer questions that have come from the public and to clarify some issues that cropped up in his previous presentation, and he's going to provide clarity. Mr. Hambides.
Thank you. Microphone's working all right and everybody can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Can you hold for 1 second? Are you saying you can't hear it out in the... Okay, can you hold for a moment? Do we have sound out there now? Okay, very good.
Okay, thanks. So, several things I wanted to talk about, and really this will only take about 10 minutes, and the intent of this is a complimentary presentation to our report, and to our previous presentation is just to clarify a few questions that have come up from the public and from council. 5 things: independence, variance is statistical values, and the number of calls for service. Those are related. Our clarification of terminology related to calls for service, and an apparent $6,279,000 variance in the consultant's calculations relative to the OPP billing model costs. So I'm going to deal with each one of those. First of all, about independence, there have been some, let me call them discussion points, that perhaps the consultant team is being guided somehow by the town or others. We're independent. We have no investment in the outcome of Orangeville's project or any other project. From our point of view, our objective is to provide factual information supported by evidence. We don't have any opinions. I was talking earlier to somebody, they said, "What's your opinion?" I said, "We don't have one." Clients can make the decision based on what we provide to them. There have been some points made that perhaps there have been a few closed-door meetings. There have been no secret meetings, and there's been no attempt by town staff, members of council, the Orangeville Police Service, or the OPP to sway our report. We've remained independent throughout. want to talk about statistical values and calls for service. What you see in front of you is a screenshot from the Orangeville Police Service's presentation of September the 9th. And do I have a pointer on here? Okay. So 2018, right here, you can see there's approximately 22,000 calls for service according to the Orangeville Police Service. And let me first say that's correct. There's no evidence that it's anything but that. As Staff Sergeant Dave McLaughlin described it, the calls for service is either when you call us or we generate the call, they're traffic stops, somebody who shouldn't be driving, and they also try to track all their activity, administrative activity, that they call RM numbers, and they understand the need to articulate what they do. So that's the description of what you saw here in the approximately 22,000 calls. In those calls for service, the approximately 22,000, we asked for information, and I'm going to describe that information to you in a moment. From those 22,000 incidents, we received approximately 9,900 response time records. Excuse me, just let me go back up here. 9,900 response time records. This is for the purpose of calculating response times. We also asked for uniform crime reporting incidents, and there were about 17,000 of those. That was to calculate the incidents used in the OPP billing model, and there were only 7,000 of those out of the 17,000. So let me describe how this comes about. So on the left-hand side, you can see the response time analysis, and that's the request. That list of items there is the request we made of the Orangeville Police Service, and they provided approximately 10,700 records that fit into that category of request. Out of those, there were about 975 records that didn't have a time arrived seen. If you take a look at the bullet points down here, you'll see that there's time arrived seen, and we excluded those from our, this is touchy, excluded those from our response time records calculations. So out of those 22,000 original incidents, calls for service that the Orangeville Police Service showed, we were able to use 9,875 of them as response time calculations. That's because somebody called and asked for help. If you look on the right side, you'll see uniform crime reporting data. And again, you will see how we requested the uniform crime reporting data. And out of those, 17,076 uniform crime reporting incidents in 2018, for example, you'll see down here that the Orangeville Police Service provided information showing those 17,000 plus incidents. There were 10,067 of those incidents that fell into codes not used by the OPP billing model, so they do not count from the OPP billing model perspective. And there were 7,009 UCR incidents used in the OPP billing model for 2018. Same for 2016, same for 2017. Okay, so that's, what that says is that out of those 22,000 original incidents that the Orangeville Police Service showed, depending on what we were trying to ascertain, there were different values. It's all from the same data set. And there's no information to suggest that the data received from the Orangeville Police Service is other than accurate. We got it quickly, it was thorough, we used the information we needed, and we got the outcome that we expected. So that's statistical values. Something that is related is the calls for service terminology and description. And questions had been raised that the consultant described calls for service within the OPP billing model as representing criminal activity, when the calls for service calculations include other than criminal activity. And in fact, the concern is accurate. We also said, when being asked questions, and we gestured, that calls for service are the type of things where somebody calls for help and the police send assistance. All the UCR codes are not used within the OPP billing model, and that's why there's the apparent discrepancy between the 17,000 UCR codes in 2018 and the 7,000 UCR codes used for billing. The OPP described calls for service as the calls for service costs represent the municipal costs related to policing services that are typically reactive in nature. Okay? Our terminology error, as describing them as representing criminal activity, makes no difference in the calculations for the OPP billing model. There are also concerns from and unfortunately this gets a little bit difficult to follow, so I'm going to go through it and jump back and forth. There was a thought that there were apparent variation in calculations. On the left-hand side, you can see this from slide 16 from our November the 4th presentation, an OPP 12-year cost of about $84 million. Now, the thought was that we also provided in our report in Exhibit 12 and Exhibit 13, that's the middle and the right-hand side, 12-year costs of $77,835,000 and $81,687,000. We did not, and I'll show you how that came to be. And if anybody wants me to back up while I go through this, just let me know and I'll go over it again. This is the estimated billing model cost that we presented in our November the 4th presentation. And if I can do this without moving the slide, if you look down here, this yellow or gold row, whichever your eye picks up, you'll see that the estimated total cost per property for 2024 was $457 under the OPP billing model cost. And that comes out of the calls for service estimated cost per property and the base services estimated cost for property. And it's multiplied by row 1, 2, 3, 4, the estimated properties in Orangeville in 2024. It comes out to $5.728 million, but we'll go back to that in a moment. So if you take a look at that yellow line, and we'll go to the next slide, the yellow row at the top indicates exactly what you saw on the previous slide, and then the next row down indicates the $5.728 million all the way across to 2036. This is the base amount that we use for all our calculations. So the calculations didn't vary, same base amount is used. So we see 5.73 million, that's just rounded up, but really what it is, is that 5.728 million that we see in here. Okay? So, in the top row, you'll see the OPP billing model cost without grants and revenue, 5,728,268. And the second column is the OPS approved budget base for 2024. And the right-hand column is the Orangeville Police Services requested budget base for 2024. And if you remember, there were two budget bases that we worked from, because at the time that we presented on November the 4th, it wasn't clear which budget base was going to be used. The next line are the grants and revenues. And so if you subtract the grants and revenues from the $5,728,000 and then add in the costs for court security, prisoner transportation, and so on, you'll see down at the bottom, the net billing model cost is two different costs. So within the approved budget, it's $5,268,000, and at the time, the requested budget resulted in $5,398,000. So now I'm going to go back. And over here, you see in 2024, what we showed in Exhibit 12 and Exhibit 13 is $5,268,000 and $5,398,000, which are the same numbers that you see here for 2024. The same method of calculation was used then all the way through to 2036, and that's why it appears that there's a variance in here. There is no variance, it's just under the different models. There's just different outcomes over the 12-year period. Okay. A couple of other things I want to talk about. Adequacy and effectiveness of police services. One of the things that we said was that both police services meet the adequacy and effectiveness regulations and the guidelines. There were comments from the public that adequacy and effectiveness of police services is the minimum that you can have. That it's not, it doesn't indicate that there can be higher standards. And of course that's correct, because any legislation or regulation is the minimum. Always provides the minimum. It's not just the adequacy and effectiveness of police services regulation. So both the OPP and the OPS meet the adequacy and effectiveness standards. It is a minimum standard. But by people saying it's the minimum standard, they're sort of implying that one or the other is more adequate, and that there should be a comparison in adequacy. So what I wanted to do was just run through some of the things that would have to be done to compare adequacy, or so-called adequacy, or service provision by, doesn't matter whether it's the City of Ottawa Police Services or the York Regional Police Services, whichever group of police services you wanted to evaluate, you would have to go through a process. So the process is to compare them and measure standards of operation. You would have to compare operations practices and policy manuals, determine comparator criteria and standards of performance. Values would have to be assigned to those criteria and standards of performance. There would have to be a determination of a method of measuring effectiveness. There would have to be a determination of service-wide compliance with policies and procedures, the percentile of meeting or exceeding performance standards, and the adequacy of remedial action when compliance isn't achieved. So what I'm getting at here is that the implication that one or another police service, whether it be the OPP, the Orangeville Police Service, Ottawa, York Regional Police, name any one, is more adequate than another is impossible to determine without going through a whole series of processes and doing side-by-side evaluation. In many cases, I think when people talk about adequacy and effectiveness, it's interpreted as service provision levels, and it's very subjective. And it really indicates the satisfaction with a service provided by a police organization, and some people can be very satisfied while others may not be satisfied. And we find that there's affirmations in favor of an organization that's often preceded by phrases such as, I spoke to someone who lives in, and they said, they have always responded to my house within a few minutes. I have relatives and they have heard good things. And even though the attestations may help to paint a picture of service provision, they're not objective. They are subjective. and they cannot be used by us as an objective measurement of service provision. So we agree that the adequacy standards are minimum. That's not a bad thing. But the implication, people who say that are implying that for some reason somebody else is better. There's no way to measure that properly under these circumstances. So a bit about oversight, very briefly. The legislated requirements of local police service boards and local detachment boards are almost identical. And we covered that off fairly thoroughly in the November the 4th presentation and also in the report. The differences, generally speaking, Detachment Services Board do not have the responsibility of direct hires, and they do not have the responsibility of some legal liability, whereas local police services boards do. Detachment services boards do have input to hiring the detachment commander, but they do not have final determination, whereas local police services boards have the final determination. They can make that final decision. So from an oversight governance point of view, those are the differences. So in conclusion, Council has the task of choosing from 2 equal police services. That's what we've concluded. There's no evidence to indicate one will provide a subordinate level of service to Orangeville than the other. So it's a matter of choosing between those police services. That's the presentation and questions.
Councilors, any questions? Councilor Andrews.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Your Worship, and thank you very much for returning this evening. In your complimentary report, you state very clearly that there's a possibility that provincial government could in fact increase the costs through changes of the UCR codes. What impact would you guess that could have on budgets moving forward?
Sorry, could you say the last part of that again?
Absolutely. What impact would you guess this could have on future budgets moving forward?
Well, the interesting thing about the billing model is it's relative. So, and I'm going to directly answer your question in a moment. And in part, one of the things that we did just as an experiment was we started fiddling around with what happens if the number of calls for service go up in Orangeville. And we used 10%, 20%, and just increase it on that basis. And we found that the costs do go up, but they don't go up as dramatically as expected. I can't remember the exact numbers. The other thing that, of course, you have to take into account is that the calls for service in Orangeville are relative to the calls for service in the province. As an example, if the calls for service in Orangeville went up by 10%, and so did the calls in the province, there's no impact to the budget because it's relative. Okay, so there wouldn't be an increase in costs. So let's say the calls for service are changed, and out of those 17,000 UCR codes in 2018, instead of 7,000, the government decided to add another 1,000 to the mix. And that would happen across the province. It wouldn't just happen in Orangeville. So from our perspective, yes, it's going to cost more, definitely, because it's going up by 1,000. It would depend on the type of incident, because some incidents garner 39 hours on average of time allocated, where others garner only 1.5 hours of time allocated. So if they all happen to be 1.5 hours, the cost isn't really very dramatic. The other thing is that the 324 municipalities that are policed by the OPP would be the ones that would end up bearing that brunt as well. And we would expect that the municipalities would team together to have discussions with the provincial government about changes. But yes, there would be an increase in cost. It's not quite as simple as saying, gosh, it's going to go up by 1/7 or something like that. It doesn't happen that way.
Thank you. No, it was appreciated.
Councilor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, and thank you for coming back for another update on the presentation. If you wouldn't mind going back to the slide where you added the grants and revenues, just, I guess, to have a bit of visual background there. Could you elaborate on how specifically the grants and revenues factored in over time? This is obviously the 2024 number. Were they scaled up or down accordingly across those next dozen years, or what went into that factor over time, if you could?
Yeah, to the extent possible, the grants and revenues were applied uniformly to both the Orangeville Police Service evaluation as well as the OPP evaluation. So it's not quite one-on-one because there are some aspects of grants that the OPS might receive where the OPP, or under an OPP model, the town might not. I think, and I would have to look, I think the difference might have been $30,000 per year. The problem with the grants and revenue is that it's unknown how long some of those will continue because over the years grants and revenue change. But if they change for one, they will likely change for the other. So it's almost a net out relationship.
Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, through you, Your Worship, to the consultant. I want to thank you very much for coming back and help clarify some issues that I felt there was some variances between your presentation and the PowerPoint for the police costing for 2024 compared to the police costing that you had actually presented. So to clarify that, particularly with your screen number 13 here indicating where those variances are, I very much appreciate you clarifying that, as well as the calls to service, when there seem to be some people saying, why is one screen 9,000 and another one 7,000? And I appreciate the fact now that you've came here and cleared up the fact that some of them were used for response time data and some were used for costing. Those were just my comments, and I do want to thank you very much for making them very crystal clear in this complimentary report. Has the issue about the DC charges that came up with us last week been addressed here anywhere with regards to adjusting of costing?
No. We're unsure about the DC charges. There was some discussion that it would require 7 additional police officers for the Orangeville Police Service. There's been nothing definite about that. And of course, we wouldn't be able to carry those costs in because we wouldn't know what the calendarization is on police officers, if any. They might not all come in the same year. They might be spread over 12 years. So the actual impact of 7 police officers is very difficult to predict.
It would ultimately affect the change of the costing that you've provided to us if this is confirmed to be needed, correct?
I missed some of that, I'm sorry.
So your original OPS costing that you gave us provided data that was required for OPS, and that did not include this $1.6 million or 1.3 for the DC charges. And I'm wondering if that is confirmed, and I don't know when all this information is going to come to light, do you not have to go back and recalculate all of the recalculate all the OPS costs for the future years?
So there's 2 parts of this. There's the DC charges, which are the sort of the capital expense, and those would be as part of development charges. The reason for the DC charges, in part, was because there was indication in the DC report that there might be a need for 7 more officers in the Orangeville Police Service. If there was a need for 7 more officers in the Orangeville Police Service, we don't see any indication of that yet, then we would have to calculate when those officers come into being, and over the period of the 12 years. So let's just say, for example, in 2025, 2 more officers are hired, but then there's no more until 2028, and perhaps the others don't come until 2036. Though all those things make a difference in the actual overall cost. At this point, we haven't calculated any enhancements into the Orangeville Police Service. If there were enhancements to the Orangeville Police Service, it would widen the delta between the OPP cost and the Orangeville Police Service cost. Orangeville Police Service cost would go up.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
Okay, any other questions from councilors? All right, Mr. Hambides, thank you very much for coming back and clarifying all of that. We're going to take a 5-minute recess right now. Town staff has to prepare for our budget presentation. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to reconvene. I did want to go back to announcements. We heard some sad news over the weekend that former Mayor Gord Courtney passed away on Friday. Mr. Courtney was a longtime member of town council, including a three-term mayor here. We have Courtney Crescent, I think, named after Mr. Courtney. He also was a member of the International Order of Odd Fellows for a remarkable 70 years. Also contributed to the Salvation Army through his time here in Orangeville. Tomorrow is visitation at Dodds and McNair Funeral Home, and funeral services on Wednesday at 2:30 again at Dodds and McNair. So condolences from all of town council and town staff to the Courtney family. Mr. Courtney died at the age of 92, a life well lived. So all the best to his family. Okay, moving along. We're now going to get into our 2020 capital budget presentation. We have Nandini Saeed, our treasurer here, with some introductory remarks. Ms. Saeed. I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan. Off to you, sir.
Your Worship, thank you, and through you to Council. I just want to speak first on the guiding principles for our 2020 budget. The town of Orangeville has a strategic plan, Orangeville Forward, that sets the high vision and strategy for our town from 2017 to 2022. There are 5 priority areas as identified, as you can see, from municipal services, strong governance, economic vitality, community stewardship, and sustainable infrastructure. Those are our guiding principles going forward. From our council priorities, we met with council back in September in a council meeting where we talked about priorities. And you can see from our upside down Christmas tree maybe, or as Nandini said, Christmas cake. No, I'm sorry, wedding cake. Council has also told us what your priorities are, from financial sustainability, enhanced communications, safety and healthy community, and all the way down the list. So from a town perspective and a staff perspective, we've used these guiding principles as we put this budget together. And this is where we come up with some of our numbers and our projects, and we'll take it from there. Give it back to our treasurer as she will guide us through this part of the budget presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Through your worship to council, I will start with a quick introduction to our agenda tonight. Mr. Brennan has already talked about the guiding principles that form the basis of our 2020 budget. I will open with a consolidated budget impact. There will be about 3 slides, sort of looking at our capital budget from an aggregate level. Then we will delve into more departmental and divisional level budgeting. I will present Orangeville Police Services capital budget. If council has question regarding more specific projects, we have members of OPS here tonight to answer those questions. We have our 3 GMs, Corporate Services, Community Services, and Infrastructure Services, who will go through their budget portion respectively. And then I will wrap up tonight's presentation by looking at or presenting an overview level of our reserve and debt. With that being said, the pie that is presented in front of you shows the overall distribution of our capital envelope for 2020, which is $15.2 million. Some of the bigger slices of the pie, so to speak, includes fire, transportation and development, facilities, parks, and water. So this pie is also provided on page 6 of your budget document. So this kind of introduces you to sort of the distribution of the $15.2 million budget envelope. As I mentioned, as we go through the rest of our presentation and delve deeper into divisional and departmental level, you will see a more in-depth section of that pie. The next slide presents budget financing by different sources. On the right side of the screen, We have a pointer here. So on the right side of the screen, we are showing the percentage. On the left side, there is a table. So gas tax from federal government constitutes about 6%, which is a little over 876,000. Development charges make up about 8% of the total financing. Reserves and reserve funds is about 22%. Water rates and wastewater rates are 10 and 7% respectively. You have grant, which is essentially the OCIF. That is about 5%. Financing or debt financing constitutes about, just trying to find where that is. That's about 16%. Prior year surplus is about 9%. And overall tax levy of 2.6 million constitutes about 17% of our overall financing. This chart represents our 10-year projection. We are projecting up to until 2029. The orange bar represents the total capital investment per year over the next 10 years. The green bar represent levy requirement. As council is aware, we have maintained our levy requirement for the next 10 years as per council direction to the level of 2019 overall levy requirement, which is 2.6 million. It is not uncommon and unlikely for a 10-year projection throughout the later years to have project light years. So as you can see, the first 6 years, we are trending anywhere between 15 million to 2021 is 35 million, whereas the later 4 years, 2026 through 2029, we're trending anywhere between 7.7 million to 9. One of the explanation of that is the first 5 to 6 years, we are showing projects from our asset management plan, our development studies, charges studies, water, wastewater rates. As we go through second, and some cases, third iteration of those studies, some of the later years will have more projects. One other point of clarification, as you look at the green bar, which is essentially our total levy impact, from 2026 onward or forward, it may come across as that we have higher levy impact. That is definitely not the case. It's the reason those years have a larger green bar is because those are the years we do not have enough capital project or we are project light. As I already mentioned, as we go through second, third iteration of some of our studies, you will see the orange bar started to grow. So that sort of concludes the overall consolidated impact of capital budget tonight. We will now move into departmental and divisional. So I will start with Orangeville Police Services capital. So the total capital or total ask is $195,000. That is spread over 5 projects. A detailed project list is presented on page 34 of your budget binder. So I'm just trying to see what the page number would be on the agenda package. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, it shows funding sources. So 75% of the overall OPS's capital budget is funded through reserve. 25% of that is funded through tax levy. So that concludes OPS's capital ask for 2020. At this point in time, I will turn to General Manager Andrea McKinney to walk us through her section.
Thank you. And through the chair, this is the first time that corporate services as a department is presenting. So we're going to start with an overview of what corporate services is at a high level, taking into consideration that it's a service provider both internally and externally to both residents and businesses, and we support the entire operation, its delivery of services. And I would suggest there's a natural synergy that comes in government modernization, service delivery redesign, and transformation digitally when you've co-located IT, communications, customer service, and finance, the way that the town of Orangeville has chosen to do. So beginning with the pie there on the top right, you can see governance and compliance. And here we're showing financial controls, planning, and management, including the development of new policies and processes, which we'll speak to later today. Clearly, the clerk's department has a role in the organization from a governance and legislative compliance perspective. But overarchingly, there's a compliance role that this function has across the corporation, and it needs to be supported by internal enterprise, business, and IT governance, which helps plan your investments and make sure that you stay on track with delivery. Now, from a human resources perspective, looking at talent optimization, we're looking at performance management, talent acquisition and retention, succession planning, training and development, and focusing on continuing to be an employer of choice. Effective communications, that's both internal and external. I don't think it's a secret that the way that people communicate with each other and their expectations around how they communicate with their government have changed significantly. And with that comes open government, where we engage residents in new ways by increasing access to information and data and increasing collaboration. So that leads into digital transformation. And government modernization and service delivery modernization require transformation internally before they can be successful externally. So from there, we really need to have the foundation in place to continue to move forward with our potential to deliver services effectively and efficiently, both inside the corporation and for the residents at large. And that leads us to the last part of this chart, which is digital government and 21st century service delivery, ensuring that people have access to the right information at the right time in the format that works for them. That's when you start to look at service Orangeville and virtual town hall type of model, virtual services that now we're increasing online access and supporting the residents and businesses' service experience. So if we can go to the next slide. So recognizing I've been with the town just under 6 months, we've put together a digital Orangeville plan that focuses on both digital government as well as some smart city initiatives, which we'll talk about partially tomorrow, that use the power of data and technology to improve performance at the town and by extension seek to improve quality of life externally. So we've mapped this out as follows. I see that it's a little bit blurry up there on the slide, the words aren't, but anyway, I'll just keep going. So connecting infrastructure, assets, and people literally means connecting our assets through new technologies like Internet of Things to systems that can enable monitoring and support our people doing their jobs. A simple example of that, actually not that simple, Data Orangeville and the work done with Esri is where we're starting to show a lot of progress, and right now we're working with our colleagues in infrastructure services to build and test Where's My Plow capability that has GPS tracking live on a map. And I just pause on Data Orangeville to say that when I posted that information, I got feedback from Denmark that they found that for a town of this size, Data Orangeville was an exceptional quality site, and they were impressed by the applications. So moving from connect, once you're connected, we also want to enable access. So these efforts are to increase information and data to be available to staff and residents, while in parallel, increasing focus on services online for residents and reducing manual and paper processes internally, which, like most governments, still are an issue at the town. Engage is critical in modern service delivery, understanding what the end user wants and needs and developing a path to get there in a way that is co-designed and is citizen-centered in its approach. So that's a shift from previously the government saying, here, I built this for you, you take it. Instead, we put effort into understanding what are the high priority areas, what are the ways that people want to receive information, and tailor it in a way that it's more effectively used. And lastly, but certainly not least, integrate. The Ontario government's Digital First initiative has demonstrated that improvements in service experience are coupled with a significant return on investment when you modernize services through automation. When you provide staff necessary tools and then you effectively integrate that data, you have an opportunity to look more holistically at the performance of the entire organization, and it increases your ability to monitor and increase your performance. So this is effectively about service delivery modernization. And when you think about 20th century business models and government, previously it was effectively an analog system and its evolution was linear. So you need more people, more resources, you just keep adding to them. 21st century, powered digitally, the potential is exponential. So it's not about adding more people and resources, it's about making higher use of what you do have supported by technology so that you can focus on the right work at the right time. Next slide. So this is an example that is intended to show that this program will be iterative in its nature, and by that I mean the evolution of corporate services from where we are today and into the future, including the projects referenced in the capital budget for this year. It's about increasing the service experience, so that's both online and mobile, and there's a distinction there. You can continue to use your laptop and desktop. Internet of Things I talked briefly about, that's the connectivity of devices. That's going to create a lot of data, which will produce the opportunities for the use of enhanced analytics, and we see some of that today in Data Orangeville already. And then as we move into new models, we'll be looking at strategic partnerships, new opportunities for investment, the use of new tools, as an example, artificial intelligence, certainly one example, but not limited to, and then continue to expand our engagement models, social media being just one example. Next slide. So some of the major initiatives for corporate services are both in our budget as well as corporate allocations more broadly. One of the first on the list is an enterprise risk management framework and assessment, and that would give us the foundation from a corporation perspective to understand what are the risks that we have. Are they high or low priority? Are they mitigated or not? And what is our path forward? The asset management plan is tied to the provincial legislation. It would be updating the work that was done previously in 2016 and ensuring that we are on path to meet the requirements of both 2021 and beyond from the provincial government, as well as corporate digitization, which is actually a focus on taking paper records, which are pervasive. We are aware of more than 2 million, and digitizing them in a way that they can be easily searched and sorted so that you don't inadvertently create effectively a digital graveyard where you've now digitized a bunch of records that you can't unlock. Moving to corporate services specifically, the Digital First initiative is intended to be the foundation for digital transformation that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, and we see some initiatives in that, including the online building permit, as an example, making that an end-to-end digital process, planning applications, council agenda software, and things of that nature. The first two will be linked to a new end-to-end enterprise asset management system, which would tag and track work orders as well as the information about the assets themselves. So their life cycle, their servicing, and in time you can use that information to be more predictive, which is clearly the path that we all want to get to. Cybersecurity is recently at the Dufferin EOC exercise, they said it was an emerging trend. I would suggest cybersecurity is not an emerging trend. It's an issue that exists today. And Jason in his infographics has put reference to the number of attacks that they rebuff every day. So I think we are aware of the importance of cybersecurity. Engagement and training is about building and improving our workforce culture and providing staff with new tools to operate in new ways to be more effective. Some of the examples would include, it's underneath as a subheading, continuous improvement, be it lean training or Six Sigma, change management, and leadership and management to ensure that we continue to focus on expanding our services in new ways. So the capital ask for 2020 in totality, recognizing the financing is split there, is 1.264850 with 8 projects.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council, neighbors in the gallery, and so on. First of all, let me say that having worked in a lot of communities, I don't want to use the word vintage, but I've been told that's something vintage. Orangeville, Orangeville comes across as a very, very much engaged community. And the processes that we've gone through in recent months will show you that. In fact, having just going and continue to go through the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, we're seeing a lot of engagement with stakeholder groups and the public and so on, and we're seeing numbers come back on our surveys that are blowing us out of the water in terms of the eye numbers. So it's quite encouraging. I entered with that because one of the things about community services is we're all about engagement. And one of the big things about this community is they want to see a lot of engagement, not just engagement with council and so on, but also engagement from neighbors and families and so on and so forth. So having that as my backdrop, I'll introduce community services capital budget for 2020. Community services is about safety, it's about engagement, it's about sustainability of our programs and services. It's about community pride, whether it's Communities in Bloom or whether we're doing gardens or how we run our facilities, how we deliver our services. We take tremendous pride in how we do that, but also we share a lot of that pride with a lot of volunteer groups and stakeholder groups that also help us serve the community and all that it offers. Some of the things that happen in community services, given the large, broad sweep that we have in terms of what we do, involves integrating community input and making sure that we get community input. We make decisions about where we go and going forward. It also talks about promoting our health and wellness as well as our safety. Not always from the fire perspective because we deal with safety, but safety to public in place, safety in public in their neighborhoods, and we work with partners and so on in doing that. Also the health and safety of people in terms of their particular health, whether you're dealing with a small child that enters the pool for the first time and learns how to swim, or whether you're working with an older adult that's doing likewise in a water environment, or walking, or whatever the case would be, to keep their health and longevity for as long as possible. So we also look at a couple other sides. We see ourselves working in economic development. Economic development is about working with business, with tourism, with culture, with doing training and so on for the business community, as well as those that are working to promote employment and building employment and growing employment in the community. So there's a big piece of our operation dealing with that. When you look at the arts and culture side and our community assets, we have lots of them. The community services, of course, deal with all facilities, including this one. It's quite a challenge in this day and age when you're dealing with a lot of infrastructure assets. These assets are aging, and that's a challenge in itself. We're taking on some rather large projects in 2020 that goes into some of the issues around aging buildings, whether that be some of the things that we've dealt with in the aging of this building, or whether we're doing things with Tony Rose or Halder and so on and so forth, and we'll get into that in more detail. But that's quite a challenge in an environment when you're trying to do as best you can, as efficient as you can, and being very effective with how you spend taxpayers' dollars. So we're quite cognizant of that and always abreast of what we want to do. If we go into our projects for community services in 2020, in economic development, our major projects are tourism strategy. The last time we did a strategy was in 2010. It's now 10 years old. We do projects or strategies on a 10-year basis, whether it's a master plan we're working on now, it's 10 years. Tourism, likewise. Tourism's come up quite a bit in recent months about things that we've done in terms of how we work in the community, what's happening in our downtown, what's happening with sport tourism, what's happening in our buildings to attract people to our buildings. What makes Orangeville a destination? Why do people come here? What do we do to keep people coming back here? Whether it's our culinary side, whether it's something in our business community, whether it's something that we're doing on the ice in a hockey tournament, they all attract people here for different reasons. Orangeville is a very, very strategic location in terms of its hub, not just in this county, but at a distance-wise with respect to the GTA. So tourism, we want to take a close look at it and see how we develop our brand going forward and see how we put Orangeville even more so on the map in terms of being a destination. Digital signage is something we're working on so we can get better information faster out into the marketplace for those traveling on Highway 10. We get into detail. What we're trying to do here is put a digital sign that's up to date, that can be updated in real time. And that's something we're open to move forward on Highway 10 next to the tourism building. Some of the major initiatives coming up in facilities and parks, we did a trail master plan, cycling and trail master plan in 2018, finished in 2019 actually. Our major project is to develop from Veterans Way down the Blind Line where it intersects with Broadway on that crossing in 2020. We're also doing a big upgrade in Casey Gardens. We want to do an upgrade to the walkway and lighting system in that particular park, As you know, that is a destination park. We look at it as a destination park. Thousands of people go through that park, not just throughout the year, but in this season coming up with Christmas and the lights and so on and so forth. And we're looking at upgrading that area. Alder Street Recreation Center, as you know, we moved a large project forward with council under the ICIP program, and we're looking at developing that as a even bigger multi-purpose building to bring more things in an optimal way under one roof. That project is round figures, a $35 million project with $10 million coming from the municipality if it gets approved, and we would expect that to get approved in 2020, sometime around April or May. And of course, some of the things in our budget will be dependent on what happens with that, what the outcome would be in the ICIP. And some of the things that are in the budget, in actual fact, will be redirected to finance our portion of the ICIP in the 2020 ask for the multipurpose building. Tony Rose Memorial Center is also a facility we're looking at again in 2020. Again, it's pending what happens with ICIP. If we don't get the ICIP funding, we need to cross the bridge on some of the issues with Tony Rose. And again, it goes back to the aging facilities piece. In the big project, of course, in the fire side is to replace the fire station. And that's an $8 million project. It's been on our radar for a couple of years now. One of the big issues we have, and we're still wrestling with, is finding a site for that particular building within the certain parameters of the fire master plan. And that sits there at $8 million. We also have a life cycle replacement. One of the biggest projects, in the fire side, is a new tanker, roughly around $785,000. It's reached its lifespan and needs to be replaced. The library, on an annual basis, we do library collections. We replace a lot of our library materials in hard copy book as well as digital and so on. And that's a project that comes on an annual basis, a regular occurrence, roughly around $190,000 per annum. And it fulfills our gap in terms of what our equipment or our supplies are from year to year. And life cycle replacement on equipment and so on in the library itself. And we also have a building reserve for library that we put money in on an annual basis. Right now, we're building a reserve for the library, and we're trying to work towards building the capacity to put in a new elevator. Again, the impact will be what happens in terms of where we go forward in the future. Major initiatives and recreation events is some smaller pieces. We're putting a new projector and screen, so on, in the Saputo Center. What we're getting with our programming is a lot of kids and a lot of families would like to see movies and training within the center. So we'd like to add that feature to that facility. Guard chairs have reached their lifespan. And again, guard chairs will either happen or not happen depending on what happens with our particular piece of the building in the ICIP. And we're going to be kind of in a gap in the first part of the year trying to determine will we get funding to move forward on some of these. The walking track murals, if you're ever into some of the new facilities these days, one of the things you want to make sure of when you walk around the track at Alder, I'm looking at Don Kidd here, who's walked the track, and many people in there as well have walked that track. After so many times around, it might get a little tiny bit boring. What we want to try to dress up a little bit and make it feel like you're walking in the park or downtown, and to put some artistic pieces, if you would, on the walls that are right now gray, and try to give it a bit more flair in terms of the aesthetics of walking around a particular track. So our capital ask represents 51 projects of $8.1 million in 2020. Our funding source is 25% from the tax levy, 32% from reserves, 30% debt financing, 7% from development charges, and some unallocated from prior year surplus. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Good evening, Mayor Brown, members of council. Infrastructure services. The four main themes that capture the capital projects that are in the draft capital budget for infrastructure services include modernizing the tools that are available for service delivery, but also available for our staff to use. as Ms. McKinney was mentioning earlier, giving our staff the right tools to do their job improves their efficiencies and will help improve the delivery of service to our residents. Health and safety and legislative compliance. There have been numerous changes in legislation that have come down from the provincial government. It's critical that staff stay on top of those and ensure that the capital projects we bring forward are consistent with those and improve the health and safety associated with our infrastructure. Capacity building is another important theme in our capital budget. We need to ensure that we increase capacity in terms of servicing so that we are in a position to support the growth that's anticipated as we move towards build-out. And lastly, asset renewal. Much of what we do in infrastructure services from a capital perspective is truly asset renewal as assets reach the end of their useful life. Certainly in community services as well as in corporate services, they've got some very exciting initiatives, and I certainly don't want to downplay the initiatives that we're bringing forward in infrastructure services, but oftentimes we're looking at renewing assets that have simply reached the end of their service life. So in terms of some of the initiatives that we are looking to move forward with in infrastructure services, and there are many, we've highlighted just a few on the next couple of slides. The Broadway Boulevard brick replacement. In the early 90s, the Central Broadway reconstruction was completed by the town, and at that time, the interlocking brick that is currently along the boulevards on Broadway was put into place. It has served us well, but this would be considered an asset replacement. It certainly reached the end of its useful life. We do a fair bit of maintenance on those boulevard bricks on an annual basis, and it's also a health and safety issue. We've had concerns expressed to us by members of the public about the boulevard bricks, and it's time to move forward with their replacement. This will be undertaken under the environmental or the class environmental assessment process, where we will be looking for input from council and the public in terms of exactly what that's going to look like when it's complete. The First Street rehabilitation. Ultimately, we're looking at rehabilitating that stretch of First Street that extends from Hanson Boulevard to the existing limits of the town, essentially where the MTO completed the repaving of Highway 10, sort of into the throat of First Street there. Again, that's an asset that's reached the end of its useful life and needs to be renewed. The third project along of right-of-way that I want to mention is the Centennial Road redesign. Centennial Road is also a road that is reaching the end of its useful life, and we want to be moving forward with its reconstruction. In 2020, we are looking at moving forward with the design and approval process only. We want to look at the various options that are available to us, and staff anticipate that the reconstruction of Centennial Road will take place over a 2-year period, with construction taking place in 2021 and 2022. Within the Public Works Division, we have a couple of pieces of equipment that need to be replaced. A rugged terrain vehicle that we use predominantly at the Greenwood Cemetery, and a trackless piece of snow equipment that's used for maintaining sidewalks through the winter. In the Planning Division, we are looking at moving forward with our official plan review. Again, this is to support growth, to ensure that the town's vision in terms of where we are going as we approach build-out can be fully realized. Other major initiatives in the Environment Division, the completion of an environmental assessment and design for a new water supply. This is both in terms of providing capacity as we approach build-out from a water supply perspective, as well as ensuring that our water supply is more robust and reducing our reliance on our high-producing wells. Water meter and billing upgrades. This is something that is both an asset replacement, but very much a modernization of service. We've had some concerns, certainly recently. People have come before council concerned about high water bills, and because of the way that our water meters work, they're often not aware of additional usage as a result of a leak for many weeks after it happens. That's simply consistent with the way our current water meters work. They were the state of the art when they were put in 2002. They are no longer. We are looking towards a smarter kind of metering where both staff and hopefully residents will be able to monitor their water usage and determine when there's issues more readily. And this is of benefit both to residents as well as to the town. When there's a leak and water is being wasted, it's not a good use of our resource. So that's another project that we're looking forward to. The West Sector Reservoir rehabilitation is something that's necessary. There is already a budget for this, and this is simply to top that budget up to cover the costs that we anticipate. Again, this is an asset rehabilitation, but it's also a health and safety issue. We want to make sure that the West Sector Reservoir is in good condition, as we do with all of our assets, particularly those associated with our water supply and distribution systems. And lastly, we're looking at some improvements to our SCADA systems. SCADA is supervisory control and data acquisition, and it essentially is the computer systems that we use to control and monitor our water and wastewater systems. We're constantly looking to improve those to allow our water and wastewater operators to monitor what's going on throughout our system remotely and to have appropriate alarms so that if something is going wrong, staff can be notified immediately and corrective action can be undertaken. So I actually have two slides with respect to a capital ask, partly because there's a lot of money, but partly because within infrastructure services we have two very types of divisions. Public works and transportation and development and planning are all essentially funded by the tax levy, whereas the building division and environment are for the most part self-funded, being funded by water, wastewater rates, and the building division by building permit fees. So in 2020, from a tax-funded perspective, we are looking at 20 projects totaling about $2.45 million, and the funding is worth taking a look at because it appears, when you look at this pie chart, that very little of it is coming from the tax levy. And this requires a little bit of explanation. You can see that there is, in gray, 18% being funded from unallocated prior year surpluses, 36% being funded by gas tax, and 32% being funded by grants. Essentially, there are certain, the gas tax and the grants, as well as the unallocated year surplus, are not project specific, but decisions have been made amongst senior staff and finance staff that they should be allocated in these areas. Essentially, if they weren't being covered off by these, they would have to be funded by tax levy. And my last slide is the 2020 capital ask from the self-funded areas within the Infrastructure Services Department. There is 20 projects totaling just under $3.2 million, and they are being funded from water rates, wastewater rates, and development charges predominantly. Thank you.
So back to me. So the next two slides, we will go through an overview of our debt and our reserve level. These two are fair indicators of our overall financial health. So we'll start with the debt level. So as of 2020, we are looking at shy of $30 million in our overall debt financing, which includes any in-year new debt for 2020. Is 30 million an optimal level for the size of our municipality? So on the left-hand side of the slide, there are three criteria that we're using. Now, by no means these are exhaustive. I mean, there are other ways to determine whether we have optimal level, but these are fairly industry standard. So I'll start with credit rating and debt to reserve ratio. Now, incidentally, these two criteria are also used for reserve level determination, whether we have optimal level or not. The third one is ARL, which stands for Annual Repayment Limit. This is a number that we get from our Ministry of Municipal Affairs. As of 2020, or I should say the 2019 level, is 10.7 million. Now this 10.7 million is not the level of debt we can incur. It's essentially the total payment, principal payment and interest payment that we can make in a year. Currently, for the year 2020, the town has 3.3 mil, which is essentially roughly about 30%. So based on that, based on the three criteria that you have in front of you, we can safely say that our debt level is currently at an optimum. In fact, we have tremendous capacity to take future debt. The next slide is about reserve level. Again, two of the three criteria are essentially a correlation between debt to reserve and credit. Debt to reserve level ideally should be 2-to-1. In our case, for 2020, we're looking at a overall $47 million in our reserve bucket, which breaks down into obligatory for 17, discretionary for 16.4, and water wastewater for 13.1. The third criteria to determine whether we have optimum reserve level is our asset management plan, or more specifically, the investment needed through our asset management plan. Our last iteration of asset management plan was back in 2016, and according to that, we have a replacement value of all of our assets at $678 million. That very plan also shows that at the time we were looking at a $5.35 million infrastructure deficit. Now, over the years, or since then, through our investment in capital projects as well as our reserve transfer, we were successful in mitigating that, that delta. However, that deficit still remains. This next iteration of our asset management plan is scheduled for 2020. It is a requirement by the new provincial legislation. So we will have a much better understanding of what our optimal reserve and debt level should be as we go through these various iterations of our asset management plan. So that essentially concludes our presentation for tonight. We will be back tomorrow night to present our operating as well as our consolidated overall impact. Before I open the floor for question and answer, I just would like to take a moment to thank Mr. Brennan, Ms. McKinney, Mr. Osman, and Mr. Jones for their presentation and sharing the platform with me tonight, as well as my silent partner, Ms. Pacheco, who is our financial analyst. So with that being said, I will open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Treasurer. So I'll start off. You mentioned levels of debt to reserve, 2-to-1. And so where are we right now? 47 million in reserves?
That's correct, Your Worship. So we have about 20 million as of 2020 for debt level, and about 47. So it's not exactly 2-to-1 ratio, but we should be around that mark. If you look at our 10-year projection, we're looking at $40 million debt level as opposed to a $93 million reserve level. So again, that kind of gives you an idea where the ideal level should be.
Thank you. Councilors, any other questions? Councilor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess a question in general, are we looking to dive right in, or are we doing the operating tomorrow before getting into measures? I do have a separate question, but I guess administratively, what's the next step?
Well, I think we kind of want to digest this a little bit. Perhaps questioning might be a little more in depth down the road. That would be my thoughts. Mr. Brennan, I mean, how do you see this play out, sir?
Your Worship, we can stay until tomorrow morning. We're here to present. We're ready to answer questions. Council can give direction, like if you don't like the percentages or where we're at, and we can come back with some of these numbers. Or if there's questions you have for the general managers, the treasurer, or myself, we can certainly answer them. If we don't have the answers, we'll bring it back. The intent tomorrow night is similar, looking at the operating side, and of course, once you see the operating side, we look at the consolidated side of the full impact of us going forward.
Okay, Go ahead, Mr. Peters. Oh, I'm sorry. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll start general then. Through you, perhaps to Mr. Jones. In reading through here, I don't think I saw anything about the potential rollout to a 4-loop bus system. Is that specifically in here in the coming years, and what sort of costs are there any capital related to those that I may have missed?
Mr. Jones.
Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Peters, you didn't miss them. The numbers aren't in there. At this point, from a transit perspective, we're on hold pending the results of the review of the Transit Task Force and the recommendations they make to Council. Following those recommendations, we will look at moving forward. And if it is the wish of the task force and endorsed by Council to move to a 4-loop system, then we'll start moving in that direction. As it stands now, we do have 4 buses. If we move to a 4-loop system, we will need a 5th, but that isn't something that is included in the draft 2020 capital budget.
Councilors? Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I guess my question is, I want council to be aware, and then my question is to the treasurer, and I did follow up with an email, but as chair of the Police Services Board, there is going to be a surplus this year on the Police Services Board, and what we would ask as part of this process is that surplus be carried over to next year, and we still have access to that funding for the police in the next budgetary session. So I think if I understood what you'd said to me is to bring it up in this forum. So I'm bringing it up now, and to be honest with you, I don't know what we do with that, if there's something you need to make notice of, but that's the intent.
Through your worship, to Councillor Taylor. So specifically, you are looking at 2019 surplus allocated in 2020. Right. So at this point in time, I would be waiting for council direction as to move forward with that.
Okay. Councilor Sherwood.
Yes, through you, Your Worship, to the treasurer. Perhaps I need clarification or direct me into the document here, but I believe Mr. Jones had alluded to the use of the 2018 surplus. So your decision was to choose to allocate that all to infrastructure and not offset our operating, or did I miss something?
Through your worship, to Councillor Sherwood. So the overall surplus from 2018 is offsetting our overall tax levy requirement. So given that the surplus was unallocated, so one of the decisions, and Mr. Jones alluded to that, at the senior management level in discussion with the CAO, one of the things we did is we looked at the overall envelope of our capital projects and our $1.3 million 2018 surplus, and we have allocated that over 3 departments, so corporate services, community services, and infrastructure services, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So the entirety of it did not go into infrastructure services.
Right, I guess what I was looking for was the dollar amount. So you're stating our surplus was 1.3, and so you have allocated the balance based on what we've dipped in for other things that have come up most recently. So it's going into capital, not into our operating budget, correct?
That's correct. So it's one of the funding sources that is identified to offset our overall levy impact. So what we did is we took the overall 1.3 and allocated evenly over our 3 larger departments.
Thank you.
Councilor Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I apologize, Nandini, the comment. So I guess I need more instructions about what we would do there. Do we would just wait till the police section comes up and then we go through, or what would be the procedure? Because I've let council now know that we want, the Police Services Board has suggested that we would do that. I just want to make sure it's Like, when would we do it? It seems like we're just leaving it hanging, and I apologize, I don't understand. And then, Your Worship, if I could stay on just for one question for yourself, and I'll get off here.
Sure.
Through your worship to Councillor Taylor. So first and foremost, 2019 year is not over yet. So we do not know exactly how much surplus we will be realizing. And I'm not in a position to project that yet. So that's the first step, is to determine what would be the overall surplus and of which, what would be the portion of Orangeville Police Services. That being said, like any other year, we will bring that information back to council saying this is our surplus for this year, and at that point you may, and I'm looking at our CAO and our clerk, at that point council can provide a direction. That would be my general understanding, unless the CAO and clerk would state otherwise.
Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Taylor?
I do, thank you, Worship. I was just waiting for Mr. Brennan's head nod there, making sure he was in line with, and it looks like we are, so thank you for that. And I guess just my suggestion is, and it sounds like you and I are aligned this evening, I would prefer a little bit more time. I appreciate what staff has done, and I don't have any questions this evening. I'd prefer that we waited, go through tomorrow nights, and we have a more robust session at another time. So if I'm quiet, it's just because I'd prefer to take the information we had and digest and come back.
Yeah, I think looking at the other councillors nodding here, I think we're of like mind. We'd like to digest this a little bit more and have a more robust question period in the near future. Councillor Post.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start out by thanking Ms. Syed for a wonderful presentation. This document was put together extremely well, and for the public who's watching, if you haven't had a chance to go through it, please do. There's some really interesting facts in there and some really great project outlines. So thank you for all the hard work to the entire leadership team of the town. I do have one question. I think Ms. McGinney is probably the right person to ask it to. I've noticed throughout the budget documents that there has been a lot of very smart services that have been added that will really benefit the community, such as the Track My Plow and the Find My Bus for transit and the water meters that Mr. Jones alluded to, and all of the data Orangeville. One of the things that I didn't see in any of the 10-year projection for the capital budget was an integration into an Orangeville app or something of that nature that can be used on a mobile phone where customers can actually receive some of that information. So is there somewhere in there that it is that I'm not seeing it, or is there a plan?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. There will be an Orangeville app. You're going to see a picture of a mock-up tomorrow in the operating budget presentation. I've worked with Jason and the leadership team and certainly our treasurer to have that incorporated in our existing budget, because the software we're proceeding with will allow us to test work order management solution in the background with both community services and infrastructure services. So it won't just be, a news app. It'll actually be a report a problem app. So it's coming out of an existing capital account from 2 years ago, which is why you haven't seen a budget request for it. But that will be, let's say Q2, Jason, is that fair?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was actually going to move that we pass a few of these things, but maybe that's a bit premature, so I'll hold off. I think there's many items in here that are very well thought out that I think we could pass fairly easily, but we'll let everybody soak in with that. But I do have a question. I believe it would be to the treasurer. So through you, Ms. Syed, if you could comment perhaps, and maybe the other GMs could weigh in. Many of the capital projects seem to have a 90-10 split, with 10% coming from the reserves. Could you speak to that strategy? Is that, what's the basis of that strategy, unless I'm misinterpreting it?
Ms. Syed.
Councillor Peters. So the 90-10 split, I don't believe is an intended strategy. And just for my clarification, are you looking at individual projects? Are you looking at overall year? So if it's an individual project, if you're looking at 90-10 split, and I would assume the 10 is being on the reserve side of things, I don't believe it's an intended strategy that we used, but if it's coming across as such, And thank you very much for going through our projects and doing that calculation, but it wasn't an intended strategy, so to speak.
I'm still on, sorry. I was just going to give an example. The Tony Rose lighting, for example, so it comes in at 26,000, and so 2,600 of that was from reserves, and it just seemed to be a trend overall. Maybe it was within a specific division. I can't say from memory if it was per se, but I guess if there was no particular strategy to that, I guess it's up for a bit of interpretation, and we'll discuss it in the coming days and weeks as to what that balance point should be.
So again, through your worship to Councillor Peters, so if I may defer this question till tomorrow, so I will take a closer look, because this has now piqued my curiosity. I will take a closer look, and if I may get an opportunity tomorrow, I will try to answer that.
Very good. I just wanted to make a general statement looking at the presentation. Very happy with it. Ms. McKinney's presentation about upgrading our internal and external communication, I think is very important. I think residents are going to benefit from this in the near future, and our internal communication is going to be improved, so I'm really happy that that's moving forward. Any other questions from councillors? Councillor Taylor.
Well, if we're offering what we're really happy about, I would like to mention that KC Gardens is long overdue for a facelift, and those of us that have put up Christmas lights in the park and walked through that darn thing in a mud bowl, I'm very excited to see that we'll be looking after the pathways and making it a beautiful park. So, Mr. Mayor, you kind of started it, and I couldn't help myself, but
Yeah,
I think it's just great, so thank you.
Very good, very good. Okay, I mean, I feel it's necessary to absorb tomorrow's budget presentation. I think we all need to take some time here to digest this tome and come back with some more pointed questions in the coming days. So with that, I think we could, I think, I'm sorry, there's a question? Oh. There's a number of recommendations here, of which I don't think we're prepared to adopt anything at this moment. So I think maybe just, do we need a motion to defer this for now, Madam Clerk?
Based on what I'm hearing from council, we'll just move it to a future agenda for you to deal with both your capital and operating budget approvals.
Okay, very good. All right, so I guess we'll wrap up. Ms. Saeed, thank you very much for your presentation tonight, and general managers and our chief, Mr. Brennan, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. So we're going to move on to question period. As soon as our treasurer is complete. So we'd like to open up the floor to questions from the gallery. Does anybody wish to ask a question tonight? Again, for the record, sir, we do know who you are, but if you could state it for the record.
Noel Ramsey, I'm a resident of Orangeville.
Thank you.
I've asked about this before, and in other council meetings, as well as, well, actually I haven't asked it yet at Police Services Board, but I'll get to that. In the budget from previous years, as well as the budget that's being looked at for 2020 and the 2020 through 2024 budget, the compensation line in the OPS budget, if I go back to 2016, the compensation was $7.5 million. It increased that year, or to the next year, by $480,000, up 6.4%. To $7,980,000, roughly $8 million. And then it increased the next year $415,000 up to $8.4 million, an increase of 5.2%. And then it increased this year up to 9 million. That was almost $700,000 jump. And that was an increase, that's the approved budget, by the way. Those previous numbers are actuals. And this 9 million is actually the approved budget, and that's an 8.3% budget. For the 2020 budget, they're now forecasting a budget amount of $53,000 less. So in the previous 3 years, it went up 480,000, 415,000, and almost 700,000. But we're expect to think it's reasonable that we're going to drop by 53,000, or a decrease of 0.6%. And my question I have put to the Police Services Board through email to the board members, and Mr. Taylor, sorry, through your worship to Mr. Taylor, indicated that he would take that up with the board. Is it reasonable to expect that increases that are in the vicinity of $500,000 each year for compensation, every year in that range, that we should think it's normal to expect a $53,000 decrease for next year? The only thing that's really different in my mind is that we're looking at a costing exercise between the OPS and the OPP, and at this point is the first time in 3 years that we're seeing a decline of less than $500,000.
Right. So if I recall, Mr. Taylor, this is going to be brought up in tomorrow's Police Service Board meeting. There'll be some clarity offered then. I think that's the appropriate time for the police service to respond. And we will, at that time, whatever the response is, will be made public. I think if you'd like to attend that meeting, Mr. Ramsey, there'll be some additional questions there. I think it's a police service that needs to answer that question, and then it'll be brought forward to town council. Yeah. Yeah.
One other similar question, and I have asked this of council before, and I have asked it of the Police Services Board, and I've got a response which wasn't really a complete response, and that is for the line item in the police budget, which is maintenance and repairs. Typically, they budget $145,000 a year. 3 years ago, it was $375,000. There were 2 years ago, $383,000, and last year, $224,000. This year, they budgeted $156,000, but next year, they're looking at $141,000. Now, I've been told that I've been asked for what the current result is so far, the actuals this year, and I haven't had any feedback on that. And so I haven't had feedback on what the actuals are for maintenance repairs, as well as is it reasonable to budget for next year $5,000 less than it was 4 years ago, when they've been exceeding it in some cases by over 300,000.
Right.
So I don't know if this is something that, like I say, I've asked of the Police Services Board, and the response I got was that it's a summary line of 21 or 26 different line items. They don't have the summary line, so I would have to come to council and ask that of finance. So the question is, where do I go to get an answer, or do we have an update on the maintenance repairs summary line for the police services?
Can I direct this to Ms. Syed? Can you give us any background on where the breakdown of that particular line item, and where are we with actuals to date for police budget?
Thank you, Worship. So I can confirm that that line item has anywhere between 17 to 21 further breakdown. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe that information was forwarded back to you either through police services or through a direct email to you. I will look into my email tomorrow morning. I do not have all the numbers in front of me now, especially the year to date. But like I said, I can confirm that that particular line item has some sub-line items that adds up to it. I respectfully ask to defer this and then perhaps follow up tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Taylor, we have year-to-date to the end of September, I believe, do we not? So Ms. Syed, if we could maybe provide Mr. Ramsey with the year-to-date to September 30th, which I believe the police service has provided. We've received that at the Police Service Board, so is that satisfactory, Mr. Ramsey? I believe we have to the end of September calculated and actual.
Yes, I have not received any response yet on that. Like I said, I've asked a few times. The last question I've got, and this is a general question, is that when you review whether it be the capital budget or the operating budget for specifically the police department versus the other departments, it's my understanding, and I'd like to get it confirmed, that if you disagree with line items within the budget, within that particular department, do you have the ability to decline accepting a particular line item within the police services budget, whether it be maintenance and repairs or compensation, or do you have to accept it in its entirety?
My understanding is no, we cannot look at a line-by-line item. As council, we can go ask the Police Service Board to look for further reductions on a percentage basis, but we're not allowed to delve into the line-by-line items of the police service budget, unlike the rest of the departments in the town. And your 3 minutes is up, but we'll give you one more quick. Can he get the microphone again there, Madam Clerk?
And just the last question, if you do not approve of the budget in its entirety, and if it's, let's say, too excessive or too high, what is the process for rejecting the budget and coming to an understanding of what an agreeable budget would be?
Again, my understanding is the town council will ask the police service to look at reductions at a particular percentage, and we will wait for them to report back to us. So it's bounced back to them for review. Councillor Taylor?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to address you, Mr. Ramsey. You know, I checked through my emails here, and I think it's important when a resident asks a question that you feel that you're being supported and being followed up upon. And I potentially would bring up something that I sent to Councillor Sherwood this morning. The Police Services Board is always going to be behind on their meeting minutes because of the way that we meet. We meet, and then a month goes by, we meet again. In that meeting, you approve the minutes, and then it goes to council, and then it depends on where council falls. So ideally, well, not ideally, but you know, theoretically, you could be 2 months before you would receive Police Service Board meeting minutes. And then the follow-ups where it comes in for you, Mr. Ramsey, is you send a question to me, and I just quickly went through, I may have the date slightly wrong, but I think you sent me something on November 19th, of which I followed up with the police on the 20th, and on the 21st, I've got an email here from Sergeant McLagan, and what he's asking me for is direction from the Police Services Board. The Police Services Board meets tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. To the mayor's point, I can't, as chair, do anything with it until we meet as 5 individuals. We're meeting tomorrow. The closed meeting starts at 9. The open meeting starts at 10. I know Sergeant McLagan is very interested in responding, so I'm certain we'll have something for you at that time. If you cannot attend the meeting, or if there's other residents that are watching, I will make sure through the Police Services Board that that information is provided for everyone. So it's, you know, when I first got on, I didn't understand the time constraints either, but it's certainly, it's benevolent, but it's slow because of the way the meetings work. It's the only explanation I can give.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Ramsey. Okay, any other residents wish to ask questions of town council? Seeing none, any new business from any councilors? I'm seeing none. So we have a bylaw listed below, be read 3 times and finally passed. A bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Orangeville's regular council meeting held on November 25th, 2019. May I have a motion to approve this. Councillor Post, seconded by Councillor Taylor. I saw your hand up there. So. All in favor? Okay, may I have a motion to adjourn. Deputy Mayor McIntosh, second by Councillor Andrews. All in favor? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.